Hi. So a couple of weeks ago, I gave a presentation to a group of graduate students in a seminar series class, talking about a simple look at diversity, equity, inclusion. And since that time, I've had several follow-up discussions from various different students and faculty members and friends and things like that, talking about these particular issues. So I thought it'd be worthwhile to post a follow-up video talking about some of those issues and how they relate to the previous presentation. So if you haven't seen that one, I would encourage you to check out the video. I'm planning on posting both of them. So if you can check out the link below and go back and see that previous presentation, I think that'll be a good prerequisite material for having these more maybe pointed discussions, talking about some specific responses to some questions that I've had. So again, I'm Chad Duty. I'm a mechanical engineering professor here at the University of Tennessee, and I'm also serving as co-director for diversity, equity, and inclusion for our department, which was what initiated some of these discussions. So I hope you enjoy it. The questions that I've been getting based on that previous talk that I gave was, how do these type of topics relate to our approach to diversity and various DEI policies? And as I look around at various different institutions, we have various different missions and commitment statements that all basically focus around the concept of we need to increase diversity. And that's true not only here at the University of Tennessee, but if you look at various different companies around, they have various different versions of this same thing, that we need to increase diversity. And some of the people that I've been talking to have been asking a very important question, a very simple question: why? Why do we need to increase diversity? And this seems to come across to some people almost offensive in some way. Why would you even question that? It's almost like a universal truth that we just need to increase diversity. And it's taken that way sometimes, but I would like to encourage us that this is not only a really good question as we're trying to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion in a really positive and impactful way. It's not only a question that we can ask, but I would say that it's a question that we have a responsibility to ask and answer in a very good in a very good way, and be able to communicate that very effectively to the people that we're engaging with. So if we don't, I think we have a real danger of instituting DEI policies that are arbitrary, nebulous, and potentially ineffective, maybe even damaging. So I think it's really important to answer this simple question. I've heard it often said, if we don't know the why, it's really hard to define the what and the how. So I think this is a really important question for us folks in the area to answer. And a really good article that I read on this from Fatiker in 2002, this is a professor from the University of Wisconsin, was looking at the various different motivations for increasing diversity. And it ranged from several things, from the external to the internal motivations, going across from regulatory requirements all the way up through social justice and professional development. But I would definitely encourage you guys to read that and see what they said. If I boil it down, it seems to focus in two specific areas, one of which is merit-based, in terms of more diversity is going to make us better. And then the other side, or the other motivation for this, is often in the moral realm, where we say a certain subgroup is underrepresented, and therefore we need to fix that because that's unfair. And so I thought we had addressed both of those and take a kind of a detailed look at both of those motivations for increasing diversity. So as we look at the merit-based side of things, increasing diversity, the statement increasing diversity is better, we talked about diversity being good in the previous talk, and we talked about Monet's garden at Giverny and how it's really just the depth of the colors and how they're so presented. It really makes the painting beautiful. But the question remains, is it always true that increasing diversity is always better? And I think that's worth asking. If an example that's commonly given is lots of people getting together to design a car. And typically you're looking at various different engineers, that, people with knowledge of powertrains and people with knowledge of structure and aerodynamics is really good to bring to the table. And it is. And maybe even increasing the diversity and not just having engineers sitting around the table, but having folks from marketing and sales and quality assurance and manufacturing and accounting and things like that. could potentially produce a much better car, and having all those various different sources of input is really good and valuable. However, if we just say, you know what, having that level of diversity was good, so having more diversity would be better, instead of having all those folks coming from different parts of the automotive industry, we replace those people with people from a more diverse background. We would have priests and dancers and actors and lifeguards and things like that. And if that's not enough, maybe we say, you know what, that's not enough diversity. Increasing diversity would be better, and have all of them speak different languages. And pretty soon this gets down to the level of silliness. And obviously that wouldn't produce a good car. And I think a lesson that I've seen, or something that I've noticed, is that diversity is great when it's wielded by a master and in the appropriate amounts and in the appropriate ways. I mean, we have, you know, a simple pie there, an apple pie, that, you know, if you put the right amount of cinnamon and sugar and butter and things like that into this pie, into this dessert, it's a beautiful experience. However, if I let my, you know, 3-year-old make a mud pie, they're going to throw all sorts of stuff in there, just because, you know, diversity is great. They're just kind of being creative, but they're throwing lima beans and jelly beans and corn and Oreos and gummy worms and all sorts of stuff in there. Lots of diversity, but horrible in terms of something that you would want to eat. So I think we can't really say inherently that increasing diversity is better. More diversity can be better, but increasing diversity for its own sake can also be a train wreck. And that's something that we really need to be aware of as we're going forward, and be very specific about what we're talking about. So in terms of being specific, when we talk about increasing diversity, what do we really mean by diversity? What is that? And in the previous talk, we mentioned that diversity is really just differences, and there's all kinds of differences out there, all kinds of sources of diversity. And we talked about diversity being everywhere. As we look around and look at any group of people, we're all made up of just various different qualities across the entire spectrum of the world. Almost anything, any group of people that you get together, you can find sources of diversity. So diversity is everywhere. So what do we mean specifically when we're talking about diversity? If we're trying to institute some level of increased diversity, we have to be very clear about what type of diversity we're talking about. Maybe it's on this list, maybe it's not. And why are we picking that particular one? Why do we think that that is the particular one to choose? So a lot of times I see poorly defined policies that just want to increase diversity, but they really don't say what type of diversity or why. So I think that's a really good thing that we could do in our DEI policies. If we don't, and just randomly pick sources of diversity and throw them together, then we're kind of heading to something that is not really going to be good. So speaking of good, we say diversity is better. And so we really need to define, what do we mean by better? And so there's lots of studies that have come out. Dezo in 2009 have shown that more diverse groups bring different points of view and knowledge, consider more comprehensive set of solutions, debate each other's viewpoints more vigorously, and lead to higher quality decisions. And that's great. That's a great outcome of that study. Like designing a car and things like that, diversity has been shown in those environments to be more beneficial in innovation-oriented businesses. And there's various different studies that have shown it leads to higher profits, better solutions for complex problems, more innovation, things like that. But again, being very particular about what type of diversity are we talking about. But these have shown that can lead to some great benefits. And if those are the ones that we're going after, then that's great, and we need to identify that. But we also need to be aware that diversity is not always better. Diversity, even though it can lead to more innovation and better decision-making and things like that, there's two sides to that coin. In tasks that are difficult, diversity may be better. In simple tasks, more homogeneous groups seem to perform better from that same study. And also from a couple of other different studies, research has also shown that diversity in a group can have a lot of drawbacks. Discomfort, rougher interactions, lack of trust, greater personal conflict, lower communication, less cohesion, more concerned about disrespect, things like that. So when we're talking about increasing diversity is good, we need to realize that that's not a fundamental truth, and that's always true, And we also need to realize that although it can be better and show some benefits in certain areas, there are also some drawbacks that we need to be aware of. So as we're coming up with DEI policies, we need to be very specific about the benefits that we expect to gain from increasing diversity and be able to weigh those against the potential drawbacks and be forthright and, just be aware of what those potential drawbacks are and be able to put them on a scale and say, okay, this is the benefit and this is the drawback. We just need to be aware of both and have methods to measure both of them. As Zig Ziglar says, if you aim at nothing, you'll hit it every time. So if we're not specific, we're just going to go off and do certain activities without really knowing why we're doing it or what we're doing it or what the benefit and potential drawbacks might be to the organization. So I think that's really something that we need to do for DEI policies, is really look for specificity. If we're looking at, now that we've identified what type of diversity we're after and what kind of benefit we're after, I think we also need to ask the question, why do we think that that specific type of diversity will lead to that specific benefit? And so out of all the range of diverse attributes, we've picked one now and we say, okay, this particular attribute, we're going to increase diversity in that particular area, and it's going to lead to that particular benefit. Well, we know that it's really hard to narrow that down to a specific trait. People are really complex, and these effects are often multivariable effects. So just by changing that one knob, do we really think that that's going to lead to that particular outcome? And also realizing that even if we have a study that says that that has been shown to be true in a certain area, does that correlation, that one area of diversity being correlated to that one benefit, does that correlation mean that it's actually causing the effect? So we need to be aware of that as well. Also, a lot of those areas of diversity, we're not allowed to select and manipulate those because of all the equal opportunity legislation, and I covered that in the last talk. So we also need to be aware that most of the benefits that are published in these studies, a lot of them result from diversity of thought, which is a lot harder to kind of quantify and define very precisely. So we need to be very careful when we're talking about how that particular diversity attribute is attributed to that particular benefit and weigh those out. For example, if we had a study in the world of banking that said a certain effect, for example, banks with a higher percentage of whatever subgroup, left-handed people, I don't know, on their leadership team earn higher profits. If we had that as a source that we could show that that was correlated, now again, not caused potentially, but that banks with a higher percentage of those on their leadership team correlated to higher benefits, we would potentially draw from that the fundamental conclusion that more diversity must be better. And from that, we might say, okay, we're working in academia where we're going to say that students perform better with more of those particular subtype of professors. And then even more precisely in the field of engineering, which is, subset of academia, engineering students perform better with certain subset of professors. And the question is, how do we know that? And we've already talked that you can't take that particular source of that particular correlation and make the foundational assumption that more diversity is always better. We've seen that that's just not true. So the question of that effect in that particular field of banking correlating to academia, or even more precisely, or more specifically, the field of engineering, is kind of suspect. And as engineering professors, we have students all the time bringing thesis proposals to us. And if this were the hypothesis of the thesis proposal, we're always asking, why do you think that that would be true? Show us some fundamental laws, or show us some, physical understanding of the universe that would indicate that that would be true. And if this were brought before us of an effect or a correlation in one far-reaching field, to be able to draw those correlations out into other areas of application would be suspicious. And so we would probably reject that thesis proposal based on poor evidence. So we really need to look at, as we're talking about DEI policies, if we're making policies that affect large portions of our society and workforce, they should be based on solid evidence that the specific intended benefits are at least highly correlated to the specific type of diversity we're seeking to increase in that specific field of use. And I know all three of those are really hard to get in the social sciences, but I think we need to do our best to get as close to that as we possibly can, because otherwise we're running a very large and expensive experiment based on a theory that isn't really well underpinned by solid evidence. So we need to do the best that we possibly can to get that level of understanding before going forth and enacting policies based on these particular things. So we really owe it to the society to be able to do that. And so we need to make every effort possible that we can. So on the merit-based side of things, when we're talking about more diversity will make us better, we've talked about that's not always fundamentally true. And as we go to increasing diversity, we need to be very specific about what diversity and what benefit, and be very data driven in our approach to that, or at least as much as we possibly can be to be searching for that. So that's on the merit-based side of things. If we look at the moral-based arguments that saying that certain subgroups are underrepresented and that's unfair, we really need to start talking about what do we mean by underrepresented? What does underrepresented mean? And I think generally what we're talking about, if we're looking at the field of engineering and academia, we would take a look at the distribution of our engineering students that are graduating and compare that against a reference population, which is typically like the US population overall. And we would look at those two numbers and compare, for instance, the orange group and say, okay, the orange group is underrepresented and that's unfair. And we would look, but if we looked similarly at the green group, would we say, okay, is the green group underrepresented? The numbers are off by a little bit, 33 versus 24%, but what's the acceptable variance in underrepresented? We need to know, we need to be as specific as we possibly can about what underrepresented means. Is it within 1%? Is it within 5%? Is it within 10%? We really kind of need to not only define these things, but have really good reasons for why we're picking what that variance, what that allowable variance is. And then we also need to be very clear about what's the goal. Is the goal to get to 33%, or is it the goal to get to 27%? And that's very tightly related to the acceptable variance. And if we're really looking at a benefit based, and I know we're in the moral area right now, but if we're looking at a benefit based approach to this, what ratio maximizes the benefit? Is it really saying 33, 33, and 33, or is it something else? For example, I really like cookies. I just really do. And then my wife adds some salt to the batter when she's making chocolate chip cookies, which I didn't really like, at least fundamentally at the beginning. But as I've tasted them, I really like a little touch of salt in chocolate chip cookies. It really adds a lot to the depth of the flavor. But if I were to say, you know what, I'm going to add just as much salt as I add sugar, those cookies are going to be horrid. And so we can't just say we need to match a certain number. If we're going after a benefits base, we need to say what benefit maximizes that potential and go after that as the goal. But if we're not focused on the benefit, but we just want equal representation, we still need to be very specific about which population we're trying to match and why. For example, we talked earlier about the engineering students versus the US population. But if we're the University of Tennessee, is the US population the population that we should really be trying to match? Should we say, you know what, we're getting our students from the Tennessee population? And potentially, I don't even know what trait this is, but potentially the traits could be dispersed like this, to where 33% of orange folks are in the US population. But if you drop down to the Tennessee population, there's not quite as many folks in the orange category, maybe it's just 12. So would orange still be underrepresented? Would there 5% difference? And again, that variance makes a difference. And we could go even further to say, you know what, we're really not getting college students from the entire Tennessee population. We're really just getting them from qualifying high school students. That's the population we have to draw from. And what if that particular population exactly matched our graduating engineering students? Would we still say orange is underrepresented in the graduating engineering students? And then that's not really where it stops, because those folks are going to enter the engineering workforce. If we now looked at the engineering workforce distribution and saw that it was 12% orange versus 7% that are graduating, would then we say that orange is overrepresented because there's more percentage-wise in the engineering workforce than those that graduated? And then if that's the comparison we make, now is gray the underrepresented group? So the reference population really matters. What are we using as our baseline? And some folks may say, well, you can't just follow the pipeline because you're modeling, or you're looking at the leaky pipeline as you go through. What you really need to do is go back to the overall US population and make the comparison there. But that's not even all the way back to the ground. Really, you need to look at the world population if that's the case, and say, okay, this is the distribution of folks in the world population. And if we look at that now and say 5% of the world is orange versus 12% in the engineering workforce, or 7% in engineering graduating students, now would we say that orange is overrepresented? And so, you would also look at the world population and say, well, there's 25% of purple and blue, and those aren't anywhere reflected in any of the US populations. And that may be reason to say, well, that's why we don't compare to the world population, because as US based schools, we have no access to those people. So how could we be expected to represent them equally in our academic circles? And if that's a valid argument, then you would say the same thing is happening to the engineering workforce, that we just don't have access to that population of the orange group. So I say all this and point this out, not to overly complicate things, but to point out that it is complex. So if we're going to define underrepresentation as a potential problem, we really need to be very careful and specific about which population we're referring back to as the ideal distribution, and why is that the ideal distribution. So this is really important as we're moving forward with successful DEI policies, is to be very specific and with purpose, right? But this does create a problem if we're trying to match populations. For example, if we look at the US populations and compare that to student employees, and if those are the only two things that we're looking at, and we have someone apply for a job that is, under the Equal Opportunity Acts and things like that, this is a criteria we could consider. If we have this orange person, or the person in the orange category, I guess I should say, if we have this person in the orange category applying for a job and we're trying to match populations, it's a pretty easy decision. This is not a challenging problem at all. We would say, sure, hire that person because they're in that population. Okay, and if that's the only thing we're basing it on, that's easy. But the problem is that's only one particular topic area of diversity. That's only one particular thing that we're looking at, or trait. There's lots of other traits that we could look at. And that particular person may be overrepresented in one of those categories, underrepresented in another, and it could bounce all over the place. So if we were looking at any specific diversity category, we would say to hire that person. But if we were looking at a different diversity category, we would say no. So that's not only just a challenging problem for matching populations, it's an unsolvable problem, because if you're trying to match populations with an infinite number of variables, there's an infinite number of solutions, and it means that there's no solution. So if we simplify and we say, well, no, we can't look at everything, we're just going to look at a few things, that does make the problem simpler, but it also a few issues remain. We need to have very good reasons for down selecting to those specific categories. If you're only going to pick a couple of things off that list, why are those the most important, right? Why are those the ones that we're looking at the expense of all the other ones? Because in that case, diversity is not really what we're after, because we're ignoring a lot of categories of diversity. So we have to be very specific about which categories we're going to focus on for diversity and why we're focusing on those categories. If we're making these selections not on a merit basis, but on a moral basis, then we need to evaluate what the potential negative impact is of this approach. And in the previous talk, we talked about how that you're missing out on a good portion of the talent in your population. So there's going to be ramifications to that. So we need to be very specific when we're talking about underrepresentation, to be very clear about the populations we're going after as the ideal and why we pick those particular traits. So if we focus now on the other side of that and say underrepresentation is unfair, that's really what we covered in our previous talk. And we looked at various different populations, engineering success potential, and we said it's really those differences in those populations, if we're coming up with valid evaluation criteria, that's leading to those differences in the engineering population, for example. So the question we asked in that was, does an imbalance mean that there's actually an unfair institutional barrier? And the answer we had was, well, maybe, maybe not. We really need to look at the barriers to see if they're fair or unfair. And a couple of examples we gave where there really were fair barriers was the prison population, and looked at the difference between men and women in terms of their aggressive nature, and saw that men are much more aggressive in general in terms of direct physical and verbal aggression than women. Based on that one trait, and it's only one trait, but based on that one trait, it's really not that surprising that that women are underrepresented in the prison population. We also looked at a maybe more silly, but potentially more obvious approach, that there's a reason why older people are not on the football team. They're slower, they're weaker, they're more fragile. And even though they're underrepresented, it doesn't mean that it's unfair. They probably shouldn't be out there because they don't perform as well and they're at a risk for themselves. So following on that, what we concluded from the previous presentation was that the difference in population is a good place to look for unfair barriers, but it's not in and of itself evidence that an injustice has occurred. So when we're looking at this for DEI policies, we really need to focus, I think, on removing the unfair barriers rather than balancing those populations that are there. So again, as we look at the moral-based argument, underrepresentation doesn't necessarily equal injustice. It's not definitive. That's why we need to look for and remove those unfair barriers where they exist. And so if we're kind of oversimplifying these to say, on the merit-based side of things, diversity is beneficial, and on the moral-based side of things, we say that we really should have equal representation. If you step back and look at that, it seems like the concept of diversity-based benefits actually runs a little counter to the idea of equal representation. And what I mean by this is, when we're looking back at the cookie example, and I know it's a bit of a silly example, but in the cookie example, there are diversity-based benefits. It's because salt is different that it makes the cookie better, but it has to be used sparingly. You can't match sugar and salt and just match their populations and expect it to be good. If the salt were no different, if there wasn't diversity, we could throw in as much salt as we want, but there wouldn't be a benefit because salt isn't any different. And if we look at that in terms of populations, we take a reference population and we measure the diversity in that population. We say, you know what, when we measure that population, we see that there is diversity. So if there are groups that are diverse in relevant and meaningful ways, relevant to the target population, then it's only logical that those diverse groups would pursue and succeed in different activities and different measures. And this would logically lead to a population difference. That makes sense. That's what we were talking about with older people on the football team. Older people are slower and weaker. There is true and relevant differences in those age populations. Therefore, we would logically expect that older people don't play college football very often. Now, the nice thing about this is that if on the outside of things, downstream from this, we want to increase a benefit, for example, with the cookies, we want to say, you know what, I need more salt. So you might go to the cupboard and look at your various different population groups and find out maybe which group is, higher in saltiness, right? And in this example, maybe the green group is more salty. So you would adjust your population with the intent of changing that outcome, increasing that benefit to add more green to the population distribution and thus have increased benefits at the end. If on the other hand, we look at the population and we say, these groups are not diverse. All people are the same. in these particular buckets, that's what we talked about in the previous presentation. If these groups are not the same in relevant and meaningful ways, so we take that diversity and we collapse it down and say there is no diversity there. If that's true, right, the populations would ideally match. If there was no meaningful and relevant diversity among those groups, then it does make sense that ideally the outcome group would match the reference population, because there's effectively no difference there. But in that same vein, there can be no benefit because the groups are functionally equivalent by definition, because there is no relevant and meaningful differences between those populations. So if we have one mix of population and measure their performance, it's going to be exactly the same as if the population drastically changes and measure their performance, because we've already our starting point was that there was no functional diversity between those groups. So the performance has to be the same. If it's not, then the groups were diverse. Now, the problem there is that if downstream we say we need more innovation, we need new ideas. Well, in this scenario, there's nothing we can do to change that, because there's no diversity. And this is part of the wonderful power of diversity, is that we have options to go to. But if the starting point and assumption is that the groups aren't diverse, then everybody's the same, and there's no way to really affect that end goal. Now, if we say, well, that's not true. Actually, these groups are diverse. Like, there is diversity there, and these groups are diverse, but yet we still want to enforce an equal population. We want to enforce that equal representation in the outcome population. Well, that's very similar in terms of going back to the cookie making experiment, to say, all right, we're making cookies and we've got all these spices, sugar, salt. On this one, it's fish spice, salad spice, apple tea, chamomile, curry, things like that. We go to our spice rack and we say, well, these are different, but we want to represent them in equal quantities in our cookie recipe. Well, that would be an awful cookie, right? I think everybody would agree to that. So as we're looking at our DEI policies, we need to be really, really specific about our diversity goals, our motivations, our reference populations that we're using as our baseline. What are the expected benefits? What are the expected drawbacks? How are we going to measure those? And then we need to come forward with great evidence showing why those particular areas of diversity we expect to have the particular impacts and benefits that we're looking for. So I think those are some potential areas that we need to really look at as we're looking at developing successful DEI policies. So one other question, or one other thing that we've been talking about with some students and faculty members, is the next question is, on average, shouldn't a sample subset, when we take it, let's say the engineering students at UT, shouldn't that sample subset accurately represent that larger population, especially if it's a large group? Like, why wouldn't we expect those numbers to be different? And so when we're looking at getting a representative samples, and we do this all the time in the social sciences as well as the scientific community, we're trying to sample a small group of people or a small group of measurements of mechanical strength of different material properties. We're trying to represent those small number of measurements, make sure that they're representative of the overall population, right? So what conditions do we have to meet to properly represent a large population with a smaller sample set? And this is well known in the social sciences as well as the science industry, or then the sciences. The first condition that we need to meet is equal access. And to think about this, imagine going to a dog show and asking the people at that dog show, do you like cats or do you like dogs better? And it's a dog show. So the conclusion that we may draw from that is that all people like dogs better, and you may like dogs better, but that's not an overall conclusion that we can draw. But because we didn't have equal access to the population, we were biased, then we drew a wrong conclusion. So that's one of the conditions. And if we're looking at the application process for bringing in applications to the University of Tennessee, we need to make sure that we have equal access to that population, not only that they're balanced, but that there's a lot of them, right? So the second one is random selection. So for example, on this one, think about if I went to the donut shop every day, which I would love to do. And let's say that I've always brought home donuts with pink icing, and those were the only donuts that my kids ever saw. Well, they would conclude that all donuts have pink icing. And we know that's not true. But the reason they would draw that conclusion is that I wasn't randomly selecting donuts. I was picking the ones with pink icing. And so that would be a bias, and we can't do that. So we have to be very random about how we pick or select things into our subset samples. So as we're picking applications, we need to be basically a blind judge, that we're not evaluating things at all. We're just randomly picking out of a bag, as if you had a big bag of marbles, gray and green marbles, and you were just randomly picking down sight unseen and picking out marbles. And that would be a good way to equally represent the population that's in that bag. It needs to be random. The third part is that we need to have a large sample set. So for example, when you're flipping a coin, you could very easily flip it 3 times and get the same result, all heads. And you would conclude from that the coins always turn up heads. But we know that that's not true. If you keep flipping it long enough, you will get a more balanced representation of the probabilities of that population. And so when we're making selections, we can't just pick 1 or 2 applications. Even if we're doing it randomly, you could pick 2 green marbles out of the bag. You would conclude that the entire bag is green, and that's not true because you weren't picking enough. So we need to make several, we need to make sure that the group that we select out of that population, that we have a large enough sample selections. So question is, does the UT admissions process meet these 3 criteria? So do we have control over our applicant pool to make sure that we have equal access to the population? And of course we don't. We're receiving applications that come in, right? We can advertise, we can do things, but we have no real control over that. So we don't know what we're going to get. We have to just look at what's coming in the pipeline. The second condition is random selection. Do we take that big stack of applications that come in and just randomly pick them? Of course not. We definitely don't do that. We are not blind judges. We look at the applications, we evaluate them critically, and we consider the goodness and badness, relative merits of each of the applications. So we are intentionally violating that second condition. And then in terms of a large number, are we making a large enough number of selections to equally represent a group? And I would say with over 3,000 students in the mechanical or in the College of Engineering here, yeah, we probably are. Even though it's only 0.05% of the state of Tennessee, we've got over 3,000 students. So we could say that the number of selections are probably good enough. So we're meeting that third criteria. But I will say, some smaller departments here, like nuclear engineering departments, very small. So you may just be picking a small enough numbers of applicants out of that large population where it's really hard to equally represent the population. So with those 3 conditions and looking at those, we can ask the question now, would we expect, as the University of Tennessee, would we expect our student population to accurately represent the larger population of the state or of the country? And the answer, of course, is no. We intentionally violate one of the major conditions of getting a representative sample, and we have limited control of the other 2. So those were 2 of the questions that I'd had, or 2 of the areas that some of the discussion points that I'd had following my previous presentation. So I wanted to kind of lay those out here in this one. And I appreciate your time, and hopefully this can lead us toward better DEI policies and better understanding of matching populations and being very specific about the types of diversity that we're after and why. So thank you for your time.